Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on the future of African philanthropy, organised by Alliance in partnership with Wings and the Africa Philanthropy Network. It's part of Alliance's Future Philanthropy series, which looks at what shape philanthropy will take over the next few years in the different regions of the world. It's a special global series which celebrates Alliance's 25th anniversary, which you can find out more about on the Alliance website at www.alliancemagazine.org. I am Andrew Milner, freelance writer and researcher and the Associate Editor of Alliance and moderator of today's discussion. We've got a panel of three guests, each of whom brings wide knowledge and experience to the discussion. But before we hear from them, let's have a brief word about the format of this event for those of you not familiar with these webinars. We'll run for about an hour. Each of the panelists will make a short presentation, then we'll have a question and answer session, which we invite all participants to take part in. If you want to ask a question, you can do so at any time by using the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. If you look at the right of your screen, you'll see an oblong white box with a chat button on it. If you click on that, as you've been shown now, and you can type in your question there. We'll be keeping an eye on this throughout the webinar and putting questions that you put to the panelists during the Q&A. If and when you ask a question, please tell us who you are and where you're from. At times, obviously limited, but we'll get through as many as we can. You can also join the conversation on Twitter at AllianceMag or using the hashtag African Philanthropy. We're also running a special offer. Everyone joining today also qualifies for a 20% discount on subscriptions to Alliance Magazine, which will include our special 100th issue, which is being released in September. So to get this discount, again on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see the offers button. So click on that and follow the instructions there. Okay, before I hand over to our panelists, let me just frame this discussion a little bit. The next several decades is likely to include more frequent and devastating global events. Billions of dollars in wealth is passed from one generation to the next. A new generation of philanthropists will play a leading role in responding to them. With more attention and demands being placed on the expanding sector, what does the future of philanthropy hold? What can philanthropy learn from the COVID crisis, for instance, that can help it respond to crises like the climate crisis? What does the next generation of philanthropists see as the most critical issues? As in all parts of the world, Africa has had to deal with the worst effects of the pandemic, with growing inequality, which the pandemic has made worse, and the growing threat of climate change. In addition, individual African countries have faced their own challenges. How has African philanthropy coped with these problems, and what shape should it take to deal with those that lie ahead? How can African societies draw on their traditions of mutual aid and horizontal giving, for instance, to counter the problems that affect their communities? And can these be adapted to more modern notions of community and online forms of giving? Recent research suggests that wealthy Africans, with certain notable exceptions, only play a limited role in the continent's philanthropy. Why is this, and what's needed to encourage them to step forward? What can African philanthropists and philanthropic organisations learn from COVID-19 about the need to support healthcare in their countries? What are the most urgent areas for the attention of African philanthropy? How does the ecosystem need to evolve to promote more effective philanthropy in the future? To explore at least some of these questions, I'd like to welcome our panellists for today. We have Jenny Hodgson, who's the Executive Director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations based in South Africa. We have Cesar Ngule, Programs Director of the Kenya Community Development Foundation. And we've got Stigmata Tenga, Executive Director of the African Philanthropy Network. We were also going to be joined by Bhekinkosi Moyo. Unfortunately, because of technical and personal difficulties, that's not going to happen. But he is recording a contribution which will go out with the email after this webinar broadcast. Before I hand over to the panelists, we're also going to run a quick audience poll consisting of two questions. I'm going to ask the first one now, and the second one after the panelists have made their presentations. So again, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen and click on poll, you'll see the first poll question. We do that now. Okay, so I'm going to read it out. What's the most urgent priority for African philanthropy over the coming decades? Is it climate change, inequality, development of livelihoods, education, food security, or other? We'll just give you a few moments to respond to that and we'll see what we get. That's a pretty even split between development of livelihoods. It looks like it's the strongest one. That's interesting. So the biggest challenge for our audience is development of livelihoods, it seems, with climate change coming a close second. Let's see if we can end the poll now. Oh, it's pretty even, actually. So climate change just comes out top with 34%, but it's fairly closely followed by development of livelihoods. Inequality down 18%. Okay, so that's interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, so now it's time to bring in our panelists. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to Cesar Ngule. Cesar's Programs Director at the Kenya Community Development Fund. Prior to joining KCDF, Cesar was a manager at the Food for the Hungry International, FHI, and Caritas Kenya, where he worked with numerous communities to design and roll out health, education and livelihood programs. He's implemented multi-year programs with funding from various governments and intergovernmental organizations, private and public foundations, corporates and other grant-giving NGOs. Welcome, Cesar. Could you talk to us, please, about how does KCDF work and how does it contribute to the development of philanthropy in Kenya? Cesar, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, so my name is Cesar Ngule. I work with Kenya Community Development Foundation. We began, I always say we began from a protest type of founding where a lot of aid was flowing in Kenya, but then there was very little control in terms of the types of projects that were being done, and most of the priorities were not necessarily aligned to community needs. And so the thinking was, how can we have a community public foundation that would mobilize resources so that you have a little bit of more control, and then ensure that you do development in a way that is aligned with the priorities of communities. And that is something that we've stayed the course over the last our 25th years of existence. The other thing is that we also try our level best to prioritize locally available resources in everything that we do, so that at the end of the day, develop, whereas we know it's a global village, but how can we increasingly have homegrown solutions to local development challenges? And so in the process, we've led a lot of capacity building initiatives for community-based organizations. Some of them have grown to be very big organizations. And of course, as you do a little bit of development, we also realize that you can't win this game if you're not working with government, policy makers, and other actors who have an even greater role to play in the development ecosystem. Now, if I can quickly just go to the discussions of the day. When I got the questions around the future of philanthropy, community work, the traditions and how Africans give and everything, I told myself that it almost sounds like a big travesty, and especially because many attempts in the past have been around importing models from other areas that have worked in different contexts. While that is well intentioned, there are very unique issues and challenges and attitudes that then mean that we must also consider, if we want a flourishing philanthropy sector in Africa in the future, then how do we then grow and build on the traditional and models that work or are proved to work in the African context. And so over the years, we've learned a few things as KCDF in supporting to nurture community philanthropy in Kenya. And for sure, if you're in the philanthropy sector, I doubt you will not hear the name of KCDF being mentioned, and especially around building financial resilience, which is key to philanthropy, because then financial resilience, and especially if it is anchored on an increasing amount of resources being mobilized in the country. And so some of the lessons that we've learned is a central role of capacity building, and not in the traditional way that we do capacity building, but influencing attitudes both in terms of recipients of support, but also in terms of those who give. And so we've invested a lot on capacity building in local resource mobilization. issues to do with the communications, how organizations can write their communications, their marketing skills, and use of mediums that work, so that you're not, whereas there are very good systems, digital systems for giving, for example, what is working, and a very good example for me would be WhatsApp groups, which are now being used and were used increasingly in the COVID pandemic to mobilize for resources and to reach out to people. The other thing that I think we've also increasingly invested in is building on the COVID situation, and of course before that is a local social capital. So you realize that many grassroots organizations, including KCDF, have their own local social capital. They know their son who is working in Nairobi, they know the local minister who comes from the area. And so how do you help them, or help communities to be able to repackage their fundraising or their communications to attract more philanthropists, or more people are able to give towards their cause? Of course, one of the biggest, of course, in doing this, there are many challenges that affect the growth of the sector. One of it being publicizing philanthropy. Many givers don't want to be known out there, and so a lot tend to give in secret, especially the ones who are a bit wealthy, because sometimes you give out there in the open, and then before you know it, the Kenya Revenue Authority and other tax people are behind your back and ask questions. And so many people tend to fear giving very openly. So how can we then support in creating a more friendly legislative environment, so that there's not a lot of fear from the very wealthy givers? And that will be very important as we move the entire conversation of Africa philanthropy. The other thing that I think has been a challenge is around legal, and is around what I would call the need for a legal reform, so that then many organizations can begin giving a bit of benefits to their givers. I know in other countries people get tax rebates or tax refunds for giving, whether it's payroll giving or a form of giving from different philanthropists. Of course, then there's a way of how do you then involve many philanthropists in the development sector by encouraging them to join boards and encouraging them to be more meaningfully engaged in the CSO sector. But of course, accountability in the sector has remained a challenge because of the proximity of givers to the development outcomes. Then it means that there needs to be a lot of accountability from CSOs and reporting, whereas many models that have existed have been very horizontal. People know how to write reports to big donors and international funders, but when it comes to models of accountability to individual philanthropists and donors, then that's an area that still remains a little bit challenging for many organizations in the African context. And probably with that, I would say the other area is the use of media to publicize. We call it, how can you use media to highlight people who are giving, and because many Africans give and many Kenyans, for example, in that case, would give because people give for a reason of a certain interest. And so for those who might want a bit of profiling out of giving, then how do we use and harness the power of media, whether social media and others, so that we are able to profile the giving and really just change the perception and do a little bit of more donor education, so that encourage people around giving, use more, target more. Many wealthy people have their groups, and so how do you use the ones that the philanthropists who are converted, so that when you help them without the message and how they sell it to their so that you have more potential funders coming out to give, and especially in transitions of wealth. The initial families that were wealthy in Kenya, now you have a newer generation in those families. People are a bit more younger. How then do you reach them through their peers and in their small circles? For now, that would be my contribution.
Cesar, thank you very much for that. Thanks for stressing the role of things like capacity building and social capital. And just to raise a question with you, you mentioned that on the one hand, there's this sort of worry about attracting the attention of the tax authorities to donors. But on the other hand, there's the use of media to highlight who is giving what and where. Do those two kind of work against each other? There's obviously a big need for a sort of satisfactory legislative environment to sort of foster giving. But do those two things work against each other?
Yeah, because one of the things is the source of wealth for many people, and I think that is now the duty of the capacity that I was talking about, so that then CSOs are able to profile and really understand their potential funder, so that if you have a funder who really wants a nominee to be anonymous because of reason 1, 2, 3, and for those ones you are able to make an exception. But there are also very many people who have inherited wealth or who have generated through legit means. So how do you then create a very good awareness and profiling for them, while at the same time CSOs doing a little bit of advocacy, so that such people are able to have a very protective environment? A very good example would be when we pushed in Kenya for a bit of tax exemption certificates, so that then you using that, then when people give, you are able to give them tax receipts, because many philanthropists are also in business, and so that then doubles the effect. But of course there are legislative challenges within that. There could be the framework of getting tax exemptions, for example, in Kenya, but it takes ages to get renewals or get those exemptions, even when there's a provision for that, largely because the government is also gearing towards realizing their own targets. So again, I was just trying to say that there's a space for lobby again around creating an enabling environment for giving. We are already doing that with different partners, in Kenya.
Great, thank you. So that's the importance of advocacy there. Okay, thank you very much, Cesar. That's great. A lot to pick out of that. I'd now like to bring in Stigmata Tenga. Stigmata is the Executive Director of the African Philanthropy Network, the only organizational member-based continent-wide network that focuses on building a multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral network of supporters of African philanthropy. Before that, Stigmata worked as a process consultant and a development facilitator for over 20 years. There's professional experience in working with the public sector and local governments, facilitating public service management reforms and public-private partnerships, both of which are very important these days, balancing the state, market and community, as well as promoting domestic resource mobilization through individual and community philanthropic giving. Stigmata, welcome. Can you tell us about what African Philanthropy Network does and its importance in stimulating African philanthropy?
Thank you so very much, Andrew. I'm excited to have a conversation about the future of philanthropy in Africa. And just for everyone, Africa Philanthropy Network is an infrastructure and a space for African institutions and individuals to interrogate and intervene in the power dynamics that shape how resources are being mobilized, how resources are being distributed and spent, and how all that impacts the possibility of transformative development work in the continent. And what is special about APN is that it has drawn interest and attracted experiences and knowledges of philanthropic enablers and developers in the continent and its diaspora. APN's mission is to reclaim the power and elevate Africa philanthropy practices. And there are 4 interrelated factors at the heart of our mission. One is that Africa and its diaspora have long history of philanthropic practices rooted in a recognition of the financial and non-financial assets associated with building society, social cohesion, transforming structural inequalities and providing gap measures during crises. That acknowledging this history does not wish away the reality of the world we live in which historical colonial legacies and the current global political order determine the bulk of financial aid resources to flow mainly from the global north. And that the flow of resources does not mean that dignity of Africa and Africans has to be negotiated away. The ability to determine the terms in which philanthropic giving occurs, for what purpose, has to be placed in the hands of those it serves. And since we understand that power hierarchies are reproduced and sustained, for us at APN, gender, race, and class must be at the center of our analysis. So systems for self-help and community giving have always existed within different cultures and traditions in the continent. And across the continent, communities and individuals are even today stepping up to provide solutions to dealing with the pandemic. And this is not something that suddenly happened because of COVID-19, but it's something that had always been here. So the future of philanthropy in Africa is not about externals changing people's perception, but it's about changing our own perceptions as Africans, to restructure our giving, to mobilize domestic resources, to ensure equitable distribution and utilization, and dismantle all systems and structures which breed injustices and inequalities. We have learned that lasting impact happens through community-driven systems change. Opportunities are great. New actors are coming to the philanthropy arena, and the possibilities exist to increase all kinds of philanthropy giving in the continent. Research shows that Africa is a home to a growing middle class in the world. Africa consumers spending was expected to have reached $1.4 billion in 2020, which signifies great potential for philanthropic growth. New methods of giving are being made possible with technological advancement, online giving by SMS, crowdfunding, etc. But there is one big problem which I would like to speak about today though. The philanthropy support ecosystem is not evenly developed in the continent, and infrastructure is still weak. According to Wings Global Picture of Organizations Serving Philanthropy report in 2017, the continent, Africa, accounts for only 3% of the global expenditure of the field, and 72% of philanthropy support organizations globally face sustainability challenge. So a conversation should happen about how to strengthen philanthropy infrastructure in the continent so as to solve challenges of today. One is to create conditions for favorable environment for philanthropy to thrive, but also mitigate measures for both individual and institutional funders. The second one is to push on shrinking space for civil society. And another one is to shift the power to reimagine ways of working with community institutions, leaders in philanthropic space and priorities, but also to increase the resilience of civil society and communities they support. And lastly, but very important, to build trust, to build democracy, transparency, and accountability. So APN is positioning itself to use its collective power of its network and South-to-South solidarity to build the case for the recognition and importance of domestic resources in increasing community ownership, unlock agency, and strengthening civil society. We always believe that there is dignity in influencing our own destiny. I would like to end up here for now, but I can speak more as the time allows. Thank you.
Steve Marta, that's wonderful. Thanks very much. What I carry away from that is the sort of your phrase about lasting impact happens through community-driven initiatives, which I think is a very powerful thing to take away from that. Steve Marta, can I just ask you before I move on? We've talked about traditional forms of giving, and you were also talking about newer forms of giving, like online giving, SMS giving. in your experience, how do the two mesh together? Is it a different audience that's using different means, or is it the same people using different methods of giving?
Okay, what we have seen so far is that the same group that has always used traditional methods of giving, and this includes self-help groups, includes barrier societies, and so forth, community savings and lending facilities. They are now they're adapting to the new means of giving. They're adapting to crowdfunding, they're adapting to SMS giving. But really, I think it's important to mention here that this is mainly done in peri-urban and urban areas. Technology access is very limited in rural areas due to lack of electricity, and connectivity is also lacking.
Great, thank you very much. We also note what you said about the need to develop the ecosystem in Africa. And only 3% of funding for ecosystem actually goes to spent in Africa. That's great. Okay, since Bhekinkosi Moyo is not here, we're now going to move over to Jenny Hodgson. Welcome, Jenny. Jenny's been involved in philanthropy development in emerging markets and developing countries for the past 2 decades, in countries as diverse as Uganda, Kenya, Russia, Singapore, and Thailand. She's been the executive director of the Johannesburg-based Global Fund for Community Foundations since it was established in 2006. She's overseen its emergence as the leading global voice on community philanthropy as a core strategy for people-led development, shifting power closer to the ground. She's a board member of the African Philanthropy Network and a trustee of Comic Relief. Jenny, welcome. What can you tell us about the work of GFCF, I was getting that wrong, GFCF, and in the African context?
Thanks very much, Andrew, and it's a real pleasure to be here today on this call. So yeah, I've been working in this space and particularly kind of keeping an eye on and being involved in the emergence of African philanthropy for some 20 years, although Becky's not here. I first met him when he was doing the research for his PhD in Zimbabwe, and I remember KCDF from its early days as it was just getting up and running. When we, as the Global Fund for Community Foundations, decided to establish our base here in South Africa, for me, one of the main reasons was, if we're talking about community philanthropy, people-owned, people-led philanthropy, it needed to resonate in Africa, where I think various people have mentioned there are systems of self-help and solidarity, but also I think somewhere where the negative impacts of formal development aid have really been felt very strongly here too. So I think if I reflect back, over the last 20 years, the conversations has come an enormously long way. I mean, the fact that we're even having a session with Alliance on African Philanthropy is notable. It feels like the time is now. We have the basis of a growing body of research. We have the Centre for African Philanthropy and Social Investment. We've got infrastructure in the form of the African Philanthropy Network, African Philanthropy Forum, the East Africa Philanthropy Network. We have emergent practice and institutions like KCDF who have reached a certain level of maturity. And I think it's really important to note that CAPSI, the Centre on African Philanthropy, was built out of a sense of possibility and alternatives. And as Caesar alluded to, KCDF was built out of a sense of rejection of what had gone before. I think the last 18 months with COVID have been a sobering reminder of what happens in a moment of a crisis. People are forced to fall back on their own systems of solidarity and outpouring of giving and self-help. And actually, the formal development system really was shown to be lacking in many ways. Money was held up, international staff left, programs were frozen. As many countries start to become reach middle income status, international donors will start to pull out. The shrinking space is becoming more of an issue. The demonization of civil society that receives money from foreign governments is increasingly being used as a tool by governments to crack down on civil society. And to be honest, we're not that prepared, and African philanthropy has a critical role to play in designing that alternative system where civil society is owned resources and supported by the people it's meant to serve. So I think this is a really important moment that we're at. Lots of great stuff happening, and we should celebrate that. But I think also, as Stigmata alluded to, this isn't a silver bullet. We need to build the systems and structures that allow African philanthropy to be seen and heard and learnt from, and to really serve as the basis of building the kinds of systems and structures that can serve people rather than serve the needs of funders. And I think in Africa, one finds that there has been an NGOization of much of civil society, because organizations have tended to look like what they need to look like to unlock money from international funders, and have not been encouraged to seek constituencies for their work. I think in the conversation around philanthropy, we need to acknowledge the dynamics around power, particularly amongst the high net worth private philanthropy, that it can be progressive, but actually often, you know, where people are getting their money from, the origins of their wealth, the extent to which foundations are being cast in the mold of the Gates Foundation, the Davos set, and are we just removing one type of money and power imbalance for another type of money and power imbalance? And I think there's an interesting point here around the sort of antipathy, the need to build at the intersections between different segments of communities. So the antipathy often of new philanthropists, new institutions that are philanthropic in nature, who don't tend to trust civil society as their partners in delivering social change, that they dismiss them as troublemakers. And equally, I think of the number of times when I've been talking to civil society activists over the years, and this is, I suppose, a kind of a Southern philanthropy dynamic, that actually people have said to me, we would still prefer to receive our funding from external funders rather than turn to local philanthropists who we don't trust and we don't see as legitimate. And so we have to really work at building these bridges and these connections where resources and understanding and trust can flow. And I think this is where the role of more democratic participatory types of philanthropy have a critical role to play in being able to enable an independent civil society that is able to speak out on a range of issues, on corruption, abuse of power, abuse of human rights, and that this is really a strategy for civil society to have constituencies of local supporters is an essential strategy to protect it, to enable it to stand up and speak out on behalf of ordinary people. If you think last year during the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, or Extinction Rebellion, or women protesting the abortion laws in Poland, this was the ability of the outpouring of people on the streets, but also of money, of ordinary people acting with their wallets and giving to bond bailout funds, and the role of the kind of ecosystem, the plumbing through which ordinary people could give in protest, in support, and be heard, I think is really critically important. I think a couple of other blockages I wanted to sort of mention, or areas that we need to kind of work on, is we need to overcome this tendency either to oversimplify and romanticize communities, and say, look, we've always had these systems, they've always been progressive, and to demonize them. We tend to sort of like move between thinking that communities are good places and there are systems of giving and help that are there. But also when you start talking to civil society organizations, I did some work last year looking at local resource mobilization for a group of human rights organizations. These organizations were really reluctant to actually start engaging people initially, until they realized it wasn't about giving away their power. It was actually building constituencies for this work. And so really kind of sharpening our thinking, deepening our thinking around how we navigate some of these contradictions and complexities as we start to grow philanthropy as a source for progressive social change. I think finally, I wanted to say that to me, that I've worked in philanthropy for a long time, and I have experienced pretty consistently turning up in international development spaces and talking about philanthropy and African philanthropy, and generally receiving rather a cool reception. Philanthropy is still not seen by the sort of international system, the mainstream system of development and philanthropy, foundations itself, as a strategy for driving development. It's still seen as a place where you might get money from. And I think we've got to grow out this narrative around engaging people to choose to deploy their resources in pursuit of something collective, to hold people to account, to make themselves be heard, and that this is really about amplifying voice, promoting collective action. And as long as it doesn't exist on the mainstream development stage, if you like, it continues to be dismissed and undervalued. So you still find, organizations I have pretty regular conversations with organizations who've never really thought about the possibility of being able to tap resources for their work in the communities they serve. And yet when you push people a bit further, many people are already involved in these systems of giving. They belong to merry-go-rounds. They belong to burial societies. They gave to a wedding last year. They will give to a funeral next week. And so somehow we've got to overcome this sort of cognitive disconnect where somehow there is a better system which is somehow associated with international funding and a kind of informal system that people don't seem to be able to kind of bring to the stage in the way that I think KCDF did very early on, which is we're going to build our own version. It's going to emphasize building the capacities of communities, and it's going to emphasize the role of local resources. So I wanted to share with one last anecdote, which has stuck with me about the relevance and importance of community philanthropy, of this democratic type of giving. And it comes from a different part of the world. The Black Belt Community Foundation is in Selma, Alabama. And I remember its director, Felicia Lucky, telling me once about what really drove her in her work. So this was a community foundation working in an area of deep poverty, particularly amongst African-American communities, massive sort of social exclusion, a sense this wasn't a place where there was philanthropy in these communities. And what the Black Belt Community Foundation had done was to start to make people realize they had resources, and if they could organize them, it gave them power and it made them heard. And Felicia told me, you know what keeps me on the straight and narrow? Every month, there's an elderly lady in our community. She goes to the bank, she withdraws a clean $50 bill. She comes over to the community foundation, she hands me the money, she looks me in the eye. And I know as long as she's doing that, I'm on the right track. And I think we need to imbue our own thinking about the potential of that, how that can really be game-changing in a context like Africa, where that giving is already happening, but we're not always necessarily seeing it or celebrating. I'll stop there.
Great, Jenny. Thanks. Loads to pick out there. Just taking up that final point you made, that sort of anecdote there. You were talking about this cognitive disconnect between people who see money is only legitimate when it comes from external international sources, and the money they give is neither here nor there. What's going to get us over that? Is it the power of stories like that, do you think?
I think it's events like this. I think it's really about working at every levels to raise people's consciousness. Actually, that what we know as humans is the importance. Money can do so much, but actually it's about trust and connection and relationships between people. This is stuff we know as people, and yet somehow the development industry has almost dislocated us from what we know. It's turned us into producers of log frames and KPIs and stuff. So I think it's really about pushing ahead with this narrative and asking people to engage in this work as people, not as experts who are producing kind of accountable outcomes. And I think that the work of KCDF and other partners in the continent, the work that Stigmata's leading with APN, is critically important in reminding people that philanthropy is about people, and so is development work about people.
Right, yeah. It's almost as if we put sort of philanthropy in a sort of separate box administered by people in suits and ties or nice clothes. And that's where the money comes from. It's not something we do, it's something other people do. That's great. Thank you. Okay. Right, before we sort of throw it up to sort of question and answer session, we've got the second poll question. So if you'd indulge me again by clicking on the right-hand side of your screen, and we can see the second poll question. So what do you think is the most important thing needed to develop African philanthropy? Is it more community-based and local resource mobilization? More engagement giving by wealthy individuals? More research, advisory and representative bodies? Or more favourable conditions for giving, like tax incentives, easing of regulation, etc.? I'll just give you a few moments to answer that. Well, we've got a pretty clear and decisive answer at the moment. It looks as though it's the first option. More community-based and local resource mobilization is the best way forward. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that. Okay, well, I'm going to throw this open to questions. So if anybody has a question, can you please please enter it in the chat, and we'll put these to the panelists. Just looking through to see if we've got one. We've got one from Eshban Kwesige. What would reimagining accountability look like? I think accountability is beyond writing reports to those from whom one raises funds, even locally. So, who wants to take that? What would reimagining accountability look like? Caesar, you had something to say about accountability earlier on. Would you like to field?
Yes, I could, and I often sympathize with organizations that want to change into local resource mobilization mid-air when you've been doing a lot of international forecast type of fundraising, because what you lack is a local constituent that believes in you and that believes that that you can be accountable. And so for me, a good example is that we have both types of funders at KCDF, and I can tell you, while we give the same level of accountability, we get more questions from local corporates and local philanthropists. They will go the nitty-gritties of all details, to the extent that if you're not very careful, it can be frustrating. But at the end of the day, then it means that that is what they are asking for. They want to be involved. They want to be engaged. They want to accompany you in field visits. They want to appreciate what you're doing. And for me, as long as we don't define accountability in the terms of the local philanthropist or local funders, then we miss the point. If it is communities giving and they are giving because they want to construct a school, for them accountability means that they will see a complete classroom at the end of the day. So I tend to think, for me, accountability I wouldn't define it as reports. I would define it in the terms of every individual funder that you're on board. What is it that you're looking for, so that you feel engaged, that you feel the results have gone? So at the end of the day, I think, in a nutshell, I think accountability is the engagement and open sharing of information around any gift that you receive. That, in our experience, that is what it translates to.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Caesar. Jenny Stigmati, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, Andrew, I can talk. Thank you, Caesar. I can also add into that and talk about accountability from my point of view. And for me, I've learned to believe that when people contribute to their own development, they become more interested and invested in ensuring that there is change, and people know better the change they want to see. And they then question more and can take more role in collective responsibility and collective rights. And I think that for me is accountability. That for me is accountability. But for so long, we have been using the vertical kind of accountability, which really had moved all of us to the margins. And we had left the possibility to have our communities and our people at the center and at the driver's seat. And I think we are all to be blamed. We are all to be blamed. So really, the accountability is where I have an ability to do what I want, to choose what I want, to decide to invest in what I want, to speak and to join any association at the time when I want to, and be able to contribute and bring about the change that I want to see. That is how I'm looking at accountability.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jenny, anything to add about that? What's accountability look like to you?
Yeah, I would just agree what the others have said. I think it's really too often the emphasis is on more kind of vertical forms and formal types of accountability than more horizontal forms, which may be defined by the people involved who might not want to report, but they might want something else, as Caesar had said.
Great. Okay. Got a question here from Alan Fowler, who asks if high wealth and corruption is a problem in giving in Africa. Stigmata. Has that been your experience?
Yeah. What is the question again?
The question, it says, is high wealth and corruption a problem in giving? Not entirely clear what that means, but...
Okay. I think what we are seeing is that, and I think we are recently finalizing the research with other Pan-African colleagues, including the Center for Philanthropy and Africa Philanthropy Forum. And what we have found there is that the high net worth individual, much as the research talks about, increasing number of them in the continent, they do not support development directly through civil society organization, but if they want, they will support through governments and politicians because of their own interest to achieve something. And that, to me, it's corruption to start with. But another thing is when we start talking about tax incentives. Enabling environment is important. I've mentioned it, Caesar mentioned it, even Jenny mentioned it in the continent. However, most of the philanthropy takes place outside the tax system. So now the contradiction that we are having is how to develop and how to create a conducive environment for tax incentives that would make high net worth individual give, but at the same time, reduce the gap between those few, less than 5% of Africans who have it, and most of us who do not have it. Corruption, yes, it is at the center. It's at the center because those who have it, they can always maneuver and, be able to, navigate through the systems and either pay or evade tax. But most of Africans cannot even afford a small mortgage to build their low-cost house. So yes, one can equate the high net worth in the continent with corruption, though it's not. It's not researched. We don't have evidence-informed data to tell us that. What we are seeing, again, increasingly even through the research, is that you don't get to unlock a lot of information about assets and the levels of investment by the high net worth individual in the continent. So that one, I don't know whether the issue is the environment are not conducive or it is corruption.
Okay. Thank you very much. We've got a question here from Mike O'Meara at EAPN, and he's asking, an independent civil society capable of taking on peers and government will need to have robust systems, independent resource streams that can't be threatened by the corrupt individuals or rogue governments. How do we achieve this at the level of the continent? That's Mike O'Meara at EAPN. Jenny, this is right in your heartland, right in your ballpark. Would you like to have a go at that?
Yeah, I mean, we need exactly to invest in the architecture that allows that to happen. And so I think that it really is the investment in structures and systems, particularly by funders and international actors who are building the system that they can leave behind in place, that can generate those resources from within and from outside where appropriate. But it's not going to happen on its own. And I think we've got to kind of jump from the idea of sort of organic community-based giving, and how can one use that as the basis? If people are doing that already, how do you use that as the basis for more kind of strategic, joined up structures that can really take on these more critical issues? And I think it sort of relates also to the point that Stigmata was just making around the sort of the sort of issue around tax. If you encourage people to give, then you can also create the opportunity for them to experience being heard. And I've given and I'll be heard. And so it's a way to kind of unlock that social muscle. So to move from the private to the more public domain. And I think there are these positive framings and narratives. I see Becky has mentioned the African Philanthropy Conference that happened last week, where there are all these examples that are bubbling up, and the importance of being able to hold them together and make sense and start to go, well, if we can do that, can't we do that? And really hold a framing of building the alternative system and structures, the alternative narrative we want in order to be able to have robust civil society that can hold government to account.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to, before we go on with the questions that are coming in, I'd like to field one that was sent in advance, and it's this: how can we encourage and support African philanthropists to collaborate, co-fund, and avoid duplication of effort? And that's from Leila Davids at Philanthropy Africa. So, avoiding collaboration and avoiding duplication of effort. Who wants to go at that? Who wants to go at that?
Let me take a cheeky stab at that. It's like, how do we encourage that outside Africa amongst philanthropists? They don't have the best track record in collaboration. So if you can answer it elsewhere, yeah. So it's not just an African phenomenon, I think.
Okay. Caesar, can I bring you in on this as well, please? Caesar in. Okay, maybe not.
Yeah, no, I do agree that one of the things that I think we still struggle with is a capacity for many organizations, and especially if I speak about Kenya, CSOs, is a capacity to do very good analysis and mapping of different philanthropy, so that then you can then map out different interests of different potential funders, then create circles. But the inhibiting factor is that when you begin talking about how the wealthy people, is that they have their own networks and they are very comfortable in that, and so moving them to new areas and new collaboratives sometimes is a challenge. But sometimes when you are able to get referrals within a certain circle, then collaboration is a little bit easy. But I do agree that it still remains a challenge.
Great, thank you. Got a question here from Steve Ogutu in Kenya. It says, in Kenya, philanthropy is largely known for in-kind donations. How can we translate that to involvement in local decision-making so that we get community initiatives with sustainable impact? So instead of giving from individual to individual, how can we involve local communities in influencing local decision-making? Caesar, that's your territory.
I could take that. Yeah. And at KCDF, for example, we realized that a lot of communities, and especially when you begin now talking about community philanthropy or philanthropy that is now happening at the very grassroots, is that people tend to give land, people tend to give what they immediately have. And so one of the things is that we've done is investing in the capacity of different CSOs to know what to raise as in-kind and to know how to communicate, so that if then you need to translate in-kind donations to cash for donations that can give you more flexibility, then you are able to do that. But also I also tend to think it's also something that is usually overemphasized. And I have been to different communities where they have got, with a good capacity, they are able to move beyond in-kind contribution, because sometimes when you focus on what you are able to, I don't think Kenyans have struggled in many contexts to raise resources in-kind. The problem has been giving money that is more unrestricted and that is more in cash forms. And so I would say go back to how can we then build the capacities of local CSOs to be able to tap into different opportunities for cash donations, so that you are then able to complement the in-kind contributions that you have. We do that through sometimes giving small incentive grants for matching, so that then with organization X, and this for me is also a challenge to many funders out there. With organization X, you have the cash contribution and you give them a challenge, and then you also build the capacity for them to be able to build By doing so, there's the incentive, but before they know if they have tested their systems and they begin realizing and appreciating they can do this. I have examples of organizations that now are doing annual fundraising dinners and lunches and arambis, but it all began from an incentivized grant matching challenge that then helped the organization build the muscles and the capacity and the social capital for that. And of course, reporting back so that next year, you are coming to report what you did with the money raised last year, but you're also raising more money for future plans.
Thank you, Caesar. But we're running short of time, so I'm going to move on quickly to a question here from Gus Ege. Do you think African cultural practices help or hinder African philanthropy? And that's a nice provocation for all three of you. Who wants to come in on that first? Do African cultural practices help or hinder African philanthropy? Stigmata, going to turn to you first on that.
Yeah, I'll be very happy to come first. I think here the main thing for me is what cultural practices are we talking about? Because we are talking about historically existence of values and principles of solidarity, of Ubuntu, of reciprocity, which have always built social cohesion in the continent. So which culture are we talking about? If it is that culture, no, it does not hinder. In fact, it supports. It supports the philanthropy the way Africans are defining it. And that is the definition which may not necessarily be found in the books of the Northern definition of philanthropy. We have just discussed about in-kind and other philanthropies like time contribution. In addition to what my brother Caesar said, I think I want to say we really need to challenge ourselves on, the best way to measure that instead of changing all that, because then we'll have to again start thinking about ways to build social cohesion in our communities. So I don't think it hinders, unless I don't understand what type of traditions are we talking about. But African philanthropy for us, it is very little finances, but it is more non-financial assets. Okay.
We're shortly going to run out of time. So can I ask each of you for a quick sort of reflection on this session? What will you take away from today's discussion? Jenny, can I come to you first on that?
Sure. I think this is a hugely important and vibrant and emergent space. And I think COVID has made the importance of local systems, local resources more relevant than ever before. The sector is still spread very thin. There are so many needs, even in the chat. There's the academic bit, the corporate bit, all this, the changing development. So it needs investment. It's around building structures, long-term systems and structures that will last. This is not about buying projects. And I think bringing in funders and allies and supporters who can help buy into that vision of the future, I think is critically important, because that's what it's going to take. It's not going to happen overnight.
Great. Caesar, what's your lasting impression from today's session? What will you take away? Maybe go to Stigmata.
Yeah, I can go first.
Yeah, okay. What stands out for you from today's session?
Yeah, so I tend to think, for me, the big takeaway is that the appreciation that where we've come from, that we're having such conversations around giving, around philanthropy, which is African driven, as opposed to a conversation on how to fundraise from other parts of the world. That for me is a plus. But I still think that the question of capacity to do that is very key. The question of identifying what motivates different philanthropists who are emerging in the African context, and the capacity for African CSOs to do those analysis is very key. And last one, I still think accountability conversations are still very high on the agenda, and we can't wish them away, because we've seen what happens. We've seen cases where accountability has not necessarily been very good.
Great, thank you, Caesar. Stigmata, what about you? What's your lasting impression from today's conversation?
So there are learnings from me, and I think one of the very most important thing which I've learned is the need for leadership to support civil society institutions and have better resources to respond to the needs in the continent. Building of infrastructure cannot be overemphasized. The importance is there. Collaboration and partnerships within the continent and beyond, it's so very important. But I think I wanted to mention one thing, that we often overlook building grassroots institutions. And as we have all shared here, these are so very important, because people at the grassroots are people who are going to be there when anything comes. They don't fly in, they stay there. They will always respond because they belong. And they will always be able to effect conversation that will transform community, that will strategize community. They know what they want and they know what to respond. So I think for me, the major takeaway is that if at all we are to come out with a broader theory of change for Africa philanthropy in future, one is centering community philanthropy in the definition that we are carrying. But the second one is to make sure that we bring transformation to the marginalized and unheard voices.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, thanks to all three of you. We're more or less out of time. I'm sorry if you asked a question we didn't get around to it. There were so many good questions and so many good answers that we didn't have time for all of them. But I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion and you'll take something away from it. If you found it both helpful and engaging, and you want to take up the offer of the subscription, please go to the offer section on the right-hand side of your screen. Let me just remind you about that. And you'll get the 20% discount for Alliance, which will include our milestone 100th edition, which is coming out next month. Finally, I'd just like to end by saying thanks to our panelists, to our partners, the African Philanthropy Network and Wings, and to the Alliance team, in particular, Anne-Marie McQueen, who's produced today's event, who's been pressing the switches and pulling the levers. The webinar series continues next week on the 18th under the title, Specializing in the Wholly Impossible, Black Women Leading in Philanthropy. You can register for this event now on the Alliance website. So thanks again to everyone, for all of you involved, and to Jenny Hodgson, Caesar Ngule, and Stigmata Tenga in particular. And goodbye for now. Okay.